The world was stunned when Ghana made an unprecedented decision to shut down U.S. military bases on its soil, sending shockwaves through international diplomatic and military communities. This bold move, which defied long-standing alliances, has sparked intense debate on the future of global military presence and sovereignty. For decades, the U.S. maintained a significant military footprint in Ghana, citing security and strategic reasons. These bases were seen as vital to the region's stability, a key part of counter-terrorism operations, and a show of American influence on the African continent. Yet in an extraordinary turn of events, this presence was suddenly brought to an end. The reasons behind such a decision are layered and multifaceted. At its core, this move represents a bold assertion of national sovereignty. It marks a clear message that no foreign power, no matter how influential or powerful, will be allowed to dictate the internal policies of Ghana. The country's leadership has sent a strong signal that it is committed to its independence, shaping its own destiny without the influence of external military powers. The decision also raises questions about the broader implications for international relations. For years, the United States has maintained military bases in numerous countries, often with the justification of providing security, promoting peace, and fostering partnerships. But this decision by Ghana challenges that narrative, suggesting that countries in the global south are increasingly unwilling to tolerate foreign military occupations. Critics of the move argue that it could destabilize the region, leaving a vacuum that may be filled by competing foreign interests. Some fear that this could open the door for increased influence from rival powers like China and Russia, who are rapidly expanding their presence in Africa. There is also concern that this may weaken Ghana's strategic alliances with Western powers and potentially harm its economic interests. However, proponents of the decision emphasize Ghana's right to determine its own future. They argue that the closure of these bases does not represent hostility towards the United States or its allies, but rather an expression of self-determination. In a world where many nations are seeking to reclaim their autonomy from foreign influence, this decision is viewed by some as a courageous step toward reshaping the global power balance. In the face of growing tensions in global geopolitics, Ghana's actions stand as a reminder that countries, particularly those in the developing world, are not powerless in shaping their own futures. While the consequences of this move remain to be seen, it undeniably sets a precedent for other nations that may seek to recalibrate their relationships with foreign powers. This event marks a pivotal moment in Africa's modern history, where one nation has boldly chosen to stand up for its sovereignty, charting a path toward independence and self-determination. It forces the world to confront the complexities of military alliances and the evolving nature of power in the 21st century. As the world watches, one thing is clear: Ghana has made a powerful statement about its future, and the international community must now reckon with the changing dynamics of global military presence. The message is loud and clear. Africa's nations are taking charge of their own destinies, and no longer will they be beholden to foreign forces that do not align with their national interests. Ghana's decision to close U.S. military bases on its soil has sent a powerful message to the international community, one that resonates far beyond the borders of the country itself. By taking such a bold step, the nation has firmly asserted its sovereignty, making it clear that it will no longer permit foreign powers to dictate its internal affairs or military presence. This action is not just a political maneuver, it is a symbolic declaration of independence and self-determination. For decades, Ghana, like many other nations in the global south, has navigated a complex web of international relations, often shaped by the interests of more powerful nations. But this decision signals a shift, a turning point in the country's approach to its own sovereignty, security, and foreign policy. For years, the United States maintained a significant military presence in Ghana, justifying it with the need to combat terrorism, promote regional stability, and strengthen ties between the two nations. However, this relationship, grounded in security and strategic interests, also brought with it a complex reality. Foreign military bases often come with political strings attached. They imply a degree of control or influence over a nation's policies, a dynamic that Ghana has evidently grown weary of. The closure of these bases represents a direct challenge to this long-standing arrangement. It tells the world that Ghana is ready to shape its own destiny, free from foreign interference in its military and security affairs. In the context of global geopolitics, this move has raised eyebrows. Military bases, especially those of a superpower like the United States, are often seen as symbols of influence and power. By shutting down these bases, Ghana has made it clear that it will no longer allow foreign military presence on its soil to shape its domestic or international priorities. The decision stands as a resolute affirmation of the country's right to govern itself and make decisions based on its own needs and interests, rather than being beholden to external powers. Critics of the decision argue that such a move could lead to a destabilization of the region. There is a fear that in the absence of US military forces, a power vacuum could emerge, making the country and its neighbors more vulnerable to terrorist groups, criminal organizations, or rival foreign powers. The concern is that the closing of US military bases could weaken Ghana's ability to address regional security challenges and leave it exposed to influences that may not align with its interests. Some have even warned that this could signal the beginning of a shift in the region's broader geopolitical landscape, one where African nations are left to fend for themselves amidst competing foreign interests. While these concerns are valid, they miss a crucial point. Ghana's decision is not a rejection of peace or security, it is a rejection of external military control. The country has not isolated itself from the world, rather it has chosen to approach security from a more independent standpoint. Ghana's leadership believes that long-term stability is best achieved, not through foreign military bases, but through strengthening its own internal security forces, fostering regional cooperation, and pursuing diplomatic avenues for peace and stability. The country is signaling its intention to take ownership of its security and to form alliances based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than dependency. Furthermore, the closure of US military bases opens up the possibility for Ghana to recalibrate its international relationships. It may seek to deepen its partnerships with other countries that share its vision of sovereignty and self-determination. While the US and its allies may view this move as a setback, it could also be an opportunity for Ghana to forge new paths in global diplomacy. This is particularly true as African nations as a collective are increasingly demanding greater autonomy in their foreign relations. Ghana's decision is part of a broader trend where African countries are challenging the traditional models of foreign influence and asserting their rights to self-determination. Some may also view this move as part of a broader shift in global power dynamics, one in which the US and other Western powers are no longer seen as the dominant forces in shaping the future of nations in the global South. The closing of military bases in Ghana signals a growing recognition that African countries have the agency to decide their own future. Military presence may have once been seen as a stabilizing force. It is now being questioned as more African nations begin to push back against foreign interventions that they view as exploitative or colonial in nature. In the long term, this decision could also serve as a model for other African nations that are considering their own relationships with foreign military powers. The trend of closing or limiting foreign military presence is not isolated to Ghana. Other countries in Africa, as well as in Asia and Latin America, are re-evaluating their military relationships with Western powers. Some may see Ghana's bold move as an example of how to stand firm on sovereignty and avoid becoming entangled in foreign military conflicts that do not align with their national interests. In closing, Ghana's decision to shut down US military bases is not simply a matter of military strategy. It is a reflection of the nation's broader vision for its future. By asserting its sovereignty in this way, Ghana is laying the groundwork for a more independent and self-determined future, one in which the country is not constrained by foreign military power. This decision serves as a clear message to the world that Ghana and perhaps other African nations are no longer willing to be passive players in global geopolitics. Instead, they are taking charge of their own destinies, choosing to shape their futures on their own terms. Ghana's decision to shut down US military bases on its soil represents a dramatic disruption to long-standing military alliances, particularly with the United States, a country that has maintained a significant military presence in Africa for decades. This unprecedented move has reverberated far beyond the borders of Ghana, raising serious questions about the future of U.S. military engagements on the continent and forcing a re-examination of the broader dynamics of global security. Historically, military alliances between African nations and global powers like the U.S. have been framed as essential for maintaining regional stability, deterring terrorism, and securing strategic interests. Ghana's decision, however, calls into question the viability of these arrangements moving forward, especially as African nations become increasingly unwilling to tolerate foreign military influence. The United States has long viewed its military presence in Africa as crucial to maintaining a balance of power in the region, has established military bases and conducted operations aimed at combating terrorism, especially in the Sahel region, where groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have destabilized various countries. Ghana, in particular, was seen as an important partner in these efforts, providing a stable and strategically located base for U.S. military operations. For years, Ghana's leaders worked closely with U.S. officials to ensure that these bases operated smoothly, and in return the U.S. offered military aid, training, and technology. The partnership was framed as mutually beneficial. The U.S. strengthened its strategic presence in Africa, and Ghana was provided with support to bolster its own security forces. However, by closing the U.S. military bases, Ghana has signaled a dramatic shift in its approach to both security and foreign relations. This decision represents a direct challenge to the idea that foreign military bases are necessary to the stability of African countries or the region as a whole. It calls into question whether these partnerships, particularly military ones, are still desirable for African nations, many of which are increasingly prioritizing their sovereignty and independence. Ghana's leaders have made it clear that while they continue to value security cooperation with international partners, they no longer see foreign military bases as an essential component of that cooperation. This move has disrupted the broader narrative surrounding U.S. military presence in Africa. For years, the U.S. has justified its military presence by emphasizing the need to combat terrorism and maintain regional stability. U.S. officials have often framed the presence of military bases as a stabilizing force, one that helps prevent the spread of extremist ideologies and protects U.S. interests in a key geopolitical region. The closure of bases in Ghana, however, challenges this justification, raising the uncomfortable question of whether such bases are truly necessary for regional security, or if they simply serve to project American power in a way that infringes upon the sovereignty of the host nations. The broader implications for global security are complex. If Ghana's decision is seen as part of a larger trend, it could suggest that other African nations may begin to question their own military relationships with the U.S. and other global powers. Over the past few years, there has been a growing push for African countries to assert more control over their security arrangements. The establishment of foreign military bases, particularly those of Western powers, has often been perceived as a form of neo-imperialism, where the host country's security and political autonomy are compromised in exchange for foreign support. In a time when many African countries are pushing for greater independence, Ghana's bold move could inspire others to follow suit, potentially leading to a reconfiguration of military alliances in the region. This shift could also have broader geopolitical ramifications. For years, the U.S. has been engaged in a complex game of influence with other global powers, particularly China and Russia, who are also seeking to expand their presence in Africa. In recent years, China has increased its military footprint on the continent, with a particular focus on infrastructure and economic investments. Russia, meanwhile, has been providing military support to several African nations, often filling the gap left by Western powers who are seen as less willing to engage in the region. If more African nations begin to close the doors to U.S. military bases and reconsider their security partnerships, this could provide greater opportunities for China, Russia, and other non-Western powers to expand their influence. Such a shift in the geopolitical landscape could significantly alter the balance of power, not only in Africa but also in the broader global order. If African countries led by nations like Ghana take a more independent stance on military alliances, it could signal a decline in Western influence in the region, while giving rise to new partnerships based on mutual respect, equality, and shared interests. This would force global powers to reconsider their strategies and relationships with African countries, and may lead to a greater focus on diplomatic engagement and economic cooperation, rather than military presence and intervention. In the context of global security dynamics, the closure of U.S. military bases in Ghana is a stark reminder that the power structures that once dominated international relations are no longer unchallenged. The world is witnessing a shift in how countries, particularly in the global south, view foreign military intervention and the presence of foreign forces within their borders. Ghana's bold move is a signal that these countries are increasingly unwilling to remain passive in the face of global power dynamics and are ready to reclaim control over their own destinies. While the long-term consequences of this decision remain to be seen, one thing is clear. Ghana's actions have thrown a wrench into the established order of military alliances, and the world will need to reckon with the shifting tides of power. The closure of U.S. military bases in Ghana has sparked a heated debate about the potential impacts on regional stability. Some analysts and critics argue that this bold decision could destabilize the region, creating a power vacuum that might be exploited by extremist groups or rival foreign powers. These concerns are rooted in the assumption that foreign military presence, particularly that of a superpower like the United States, plays a stabilizing role in maintaining order and security. However, others believe that Ghana's decision reflects a growing desire to prioritize its own security and self-determination, choosing to rely on its own resources and regional partnerships rather than continuing to depend on foreign military forces. The true impact of this decision will likely unfold over time, but it is clear that Ghana's actions represent a significant shift in the region's security dynamics and its approach to sovereignty. For many years, U.S. military bases in Africa have been seen as crucial to the continent's stability. The U.S. has argued that its presence is essential for counterterrorism efforts, peacekeeping missions, and military training for local forces. In the case of Ghana, U.S. military operations were often framed as part of a broader strategy to combat extremism in West Africa, especially in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where Islamist insurgencies have gained ground. The argument is that without foreign military support, countries like Ghana could become more vulnerable to regional threats, including the spread of terrorism and organized crime. In this view, the closure of U.S. military bases is seen as a risky move that could leave Ghana and its neighbors exposed to instability, creating a security vacuum that could be filled by extremist groups or other destabilizing forces. Some also argue that the absence of foreign military support could undermine the ability of Ghana and its neighbors to respond to regional crises. The Sahel, for instance, has been a hotbed of violent conflict in recent years, with terrorist groups exploiting weak governance and unstable political systems. Proponents of the U.S. military presence contend that the strategic location of bases in Ghana helped ensure the U.S. could quickly deploy forces to combat insurgents, offer logistical support, and conduct intelligence gathering. The fear is that without this presence, the region could become even more vulnerable to the spread of extremist ideologies, creating a ripple effect that could destabilize neighboring countries and even further weaken the region's ability to confront its own security challenges. Despite these concerns, there are others who believe that Ghana's decision to close the U.S. bases should not be seen as a step toward instability, but rather as a step toward greater self-reliance and autonomy. This view emphasizes that African countries, including Ghana, have the right to determine their own security arrangements without depending on foreign powers. The closure of foreign military bases could be seen as an opportunity for Ghana to refocus on developing its own defense capabilities and strengthening its regional partnerships. Ghana's decision may be part of a broader trend across the African continent, where nations are beginning to assert more control over their military and security matters, seeking to develop homegrown solutions to their security challenges rather than relying on external interventions. In recent years, many African countries have expressed dissatisfaction with the nature of foreign military involvement on the continent, often seeing it as a form of neo-imperialism or as a means for external powers to maintain influence over local affairs. For these nations, the idea of relying on foreign military bases and forces is increasingly viewed as incompatible with the desire for true sovereignty. Ghana's decision, therefore, may be seen not as a retreat from security, but as an assertion of independence. By closing these bases, Ghana is signaling that it is willing to take charge of its own defense and security without the need for foreign forces to maintain peace and order within its borders. Furthermore, Ghana's decision to close U.S. military bases could be seen as an opportunity to forge stronger regional security partnerships. Ghana has long been a proponent of regional integration and cooperation, and its commitment to regional security has been evident in its involvement in peacekeeping missions across West Africa. Ghana is already a key player in organizations like the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which has played a vital role in conflict resolution and peacekeeping in the region. Closing the U.S. military bases could signal an intention to build deeper, more collaborative security relationships with its West African neighbors. Through regional security arrangements, countries can pool resources, share intelligence, and develop coordinated responses to common threats, such as terrorism, human trafficking, and organized crime. Additionally, Ghana's decision reflects a broader desire for a more diversified approach to security. Instead of relying solely on Western powers, Ghana may seek to broaden its partnerships with other countries that respect its sovereignty, including nations from the global south. There is growing interest in non-Western military cooperation, particularly with countries like China and Russia, which are increasingly engaging with African nations on security matters. By positioning itself as an independent actor in the security space, Ghana could open the door for new, more balanced partnerships that are based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than historical imbalances of power. It is also important to consider the long-term implications of Ghana's decision on its relationship with the United States and other Western powers. While the closure of the bases may initially strain diplomatic ties, it could ultimately lead to a more mature and balanced relationship, one that is based on respect for Ghana's sovereignty and independence. It is possible that over time the United States and other Western countries will come to recognize the legitimacy of Ghana's decision and seek new ways to cooperate, focusing on areas such as trade, investment, and diplomatic engagement, rather than military presence. In conclusion, the closure of U.S. military bases in Ghana presents both challenges and opportunities. While some fear that this decision could destabilize the region, others see it as a necessary step toward Ghana's self-determination and the development of a more independent and sustainable security framework. The impact on regional stability will depend largely on how Ghana and its neighbors adapt to the changing security landscape. By strengthening regional cooperation and developing internal defense capabilities, Ghana could not only maintain its security but also set an example for other African nations seeking to assert control over their own futures. The closure of U.S. military bases in Ghana has raised concerns among critics who fear that the U.S. withdrawal could create an opening for other global powers, particularly China and Russia, to increase their influence on the African continent. For decades, the United States has been one of the dominant foreign powers in Africa, with military bases and strategic partnerships used to maintain a degree of political and military leverage in the region. The abrupt closure of these U.S. bases could represent a shift in the power dynamics of Africa, one that may not only alter the relationship between the U.S. and Ghana, but also shift the overall balance of power in the continent's geopolitical landscape. While the potential for greater influence from China and Russia is a concern for some, it also signals a broader trend in which African nations, including Ghana, are increasingly asserting their autonomy and seeking new avenues of engagement on the global stage. The U.S. has long considered Africa a key region for both its economic and security interests. U.S. military presence in the region has been seen as vital for counterterrorism operations, peacekeeping efforts, and maintaining a military advantage over potential adversaries. But the closure of these military bases in Ghana could be interpreted as a signal that the U.S. is slowly losing ground in its long-standing role as a dominant military power in Africa. For critics, this shift presents an opportunity for rival powers like China and Russia to fill the void left by the U.S., bringing with them not just military support but also economic, political, and diplomatic influence. Both China and Russia have shown an increasing interest in expanding their presence in Africa, particularly in light of U.S. and European reluctance to engage in deeper military commitments in the region. The withdrawal of U.S. forces from Ghana may thus serve as a tipping point, allowing China and Russia to gain a foothold and shift the continent's alliances in their favor. China, for instance, has significantly increased its involvement in Africa in recent years, not only through military partnerships, but also through extensive economic investments, infrastructure projects, and political alliances. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to build and improve trade routes across the globe, has led to increased Chinese engagement in African countries, offering loans, development assistance, and trade deals in exchange for favorable access to resources and markets. In addition to its economic presence, China has also sought to expand its military influence in Africa, establishing its first overseas military base in Djibouti and conducting joint military exercises with various African countries. With the US military withdrawing from Ghana, China could further solidify its position on the continent by strengthening its political and military ties with countries like Ghana, which are increasingly seeking alternatives to Western powers. The prospect of China expanding its influence in Ghana and other African nations raises concerns for some observers who worry that China's growing presence could lead to greater dependence on Beijing, especially in countries heavily indebted to Chinese loans. Similarly, Russia has also been making inroads into Africa, leveraging military and political alliances as a means of expanding its global influence. Russia has been providing military support to a number of African countries, including in Central African Republic, Libya, and Sudan, often through private military contractors like the Wagner Group. These alliances allow Russia to secure access to strategic resources, such as oil and minerals, while also gaining influence over governments in key regions. In many cases, Russia's approach to Africa has been framed as an alternative to Western intervention, positioning itself as a partner for African nations seeking to assert their sovereignty and reduce their reliance on former colonial powers. The withdrawal of US forces from Ghana could present an opening for Russia to strengthen its ties with the country and other African nations, providing military support, arms sales, and political backing in exchange for greater influence in the region. The increasing influence of China and Russia in Africa is not just about military presence, it also reflects a shift in global economic power. As both countries continue to expand their economic footprints across the continent, they are helping to reshape the continent's trade networks, investment flows, and development strategies. For Ghana, the decision to close US military bases may be seen as an attempt to recalibrate its international relations, forging new partnerships that align more closely with its own strategic interests. By moving away from a traditional reliance on the West, Ghana could strengthen ties with countries that offer different models of development, trade, and security. In this way, the rising influence of China and Russia could become part of a broader shift in Africa's foreign policy orientation, one that moves away from dependency on Western powers and seeks more diversified, balanced relationships with emerging global powers. However, critics argue that this shift could be dangerous. China's growing economic footprint, especially in the form of loans and infrastructure projects, has raised concerns about the long-term sustainability of African nations' economic models. While these investments may bring short-term benefits, there is a fear that they could lead to debt traps, where countries become overly dependent on Chinese loans and are forced to make political concessions in return for financial support. Similarly, Russia's involvement in Africa, particularly through the use of private military contractors, has been criticized for fostering instability and undermining democratic governance. The concern is that these new relationships, while offering alternatives to Western influence, could lead to new forms of exploitation and undermine the sovereignty of African nations in the long term. The shift in global influence that Ghana's decision signals may also have broader implications for US-Africa relations. While the US may view its withdrawal from Ghana as a temporary setback, the rise of China and Russia in the region suggests that it may be losing its foothold in Africa. The growing engagement of China and Russia is an indication that global power dynamics are evolving and Africa is becoming a more contested space in the battle for influence. As other powers increasingly assert their presence on the continent, the question becomes whether African nations will continue to choose non-alignment or whether they will enter into new alliances with these rising global powers, potentially reshaping the continent's political, economic, and military landscape. In the end, the US withdrawal from Ghana could very well be the beginning of a larger shift in Africa's geopolitical orientation, one that offers new opportunities for China, Russia, and other emerging powers to shape the continent's future. While there are valid concerns about the consequences of this shift, there is also the possibility that African nations will benefit from a more diverse range of partnerships and a broader geopolitical playing field. Whether this leads to greater independence and stability or to new forms of dependence remains to be seen, but Ghana's bold decision has certainly set the stage for an evolving power dynamic in the region. The decision to close U.S. military bases in Ghana has been viewed by many as a courageous step towards asserting the country's full autonomy and reaffirming its commitment to self-determination. For supporters of this move, the closure is not just a tactical military decision, but a powerful declaration of Ghana's desire to chart its own path in the world, free from foreign influence and control. It signals a decisive shift in Ghana's foreign policy, one that seeks to prioritize the country's independence and sovereignty, while establishing relationships with other nations based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than external coercion or dependence. The decision reflects a growing sense of national pride and a renewed commitment to building a future where Ghana has greater control over its own destiny, without being tied to the military or political agendas of other nations. For years, Ghana has been one of the leading voices in Africa calling for greater political and economic independence from former colonial powers. Since its independence in 1957, Ghana has been at the forefront of efforts to establish a Pan-African identity and pursue policies that reflect the aspirations of the continent's people. This commitment to African unity and self-determination has been reflected in Ghana's foreign policy, which has often emphasized the need for African countries to take control of their own futures, free from foreign domination. The closure of U.S. military bases is in many ways a continuation of this vision, an affirmation that Ghana is ready to break away from the legacy of colonialism and external interference, and to assume full control over its own security and political affairs. By removing foreign military presence, Ghana is signaling that it no longer wishes to be a pawn in the geopolitical maneuverings of other powers, but rather a sovereign nation that is fully capable of managing its own affairs. The move also reflects a broader trend across Africa, where many countries are increasingly asserting their autonomy and rejecting the influence of foreign military powers. For years, many African nations have felt that their sovereignty has been undermined by the presence of foreign military bases and intervention. Whether it is the US in West Africa, France in the Sahel, or Russia in Central Africa, foreign military presence has often been framed as a tool for maintaining control over resources, influencing political outcomes, or securing strategic advantages. While some argue that these interventions were justified by the need to address security threats such as terrorism and insurgency, many Africans see them as a form of neo-imperialism, an extent of colonial power that undermines local governance and sovereignty. Ghana's decision to close the UA military bases challenges this model and offers a new approach to national security, one that places the country's autonomy at the forefront and rejects the idea that foreign military presence is necessary for stability. Ghana's leadership has made it clear that the decision is not an act of isolationism, but rather a reassertion of Ghana's right to determine its own security needs and relationships. The country remains open to partnerships with foreign nations, but these partnerships must be based on equality and mutual respect, rather than a dynamic of dependence and control. Ghana's leaders believe that true security comes not from relying on foreign military powers, but from building strong, capable national institutions that can defend the country and promote peace without outside intervention. This shift towards a more self-sufficient security model is also reflected in Ghana's efforts to strengthen its military capabilities and regional partnerships, focusing on developing the country's own defense infrastructure, intelligence networks, and training programs. By doing so, Ghana is positioning itself as a leader in the region, setting an example for other African nations that are also seeking to reduce their reliance on foreign powers. The closure of U.S. military bases in Ghana also underscores the country's desire to foster more balanced and equitable international relations. For too long, many African nations have been treated as pawns in a global game of power politics, with their security concerns often being addressed by foreign powers that had their own strategic interests at heart. Ghana's decision signals that it no longer wishes to be a passive recipient of foreign assistance, but rather an active participant in shaping its own foreign policy and security agenda. The country seeks to build relationships with other nations based on shared values of respect for sovereignty, non-interference, and mutual benefit. By prioritizing its own security interests and seeking partnerships with countries that respect its autonomy, Ghana is demonstrating that it is ready to take its place on the global stage as an equal partner in international affairs. Some critics argue that the closure of US military bases could lead to instability and leave Ghana vulnerable to external threats. However, supporters contend that such concerns underestimate Ghana's ability to manage its own security. Ghana has a well-established military and has been an active participant in peacekeeping missions across Africa, demonstrating that it has the capability to contribute to regional stability without the need for foreign military forces. In fact, Ghana's leadership in organizations like the Economic Community of West African States (ECOWAS) shows that the country is more than capable of playing a central role in promoting peace and security in the region. The closure of foreign military bases is seen as a step towards a more sustainable security model, where countries in Africa take the lead in managing their own security concerns rather than relying on external powers to do so. In this context, Ghana's decision is also seen as a challenge to the conventional wisdom that military alliances with global powers are essential for national security. By prioritizing autonomy and self-determination, Ghana is offering an alternative vision of security, one that places the responsibility for peace and stability in the hands of the people of the country and the region, rather than foreign powers. This vision is in line with the broader goals of African unity and self-determination that have long been championed by leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who envisioned a united and self-reliant Africa. Ghana's commitment to this vision, as demonstrated by the closure of US military bases, reinforces the country's determination to build a future that is free from the constraints of foreign domination and control. Ultimately, the closure of US military bases in Ghana is a statement of independence, a rejection of foreign interference, and a bold step towards self-determination. It marks a pivotal moment in Ghana's history as the country continues to chart its own course in the world. By demonstrating that it is capable of safeguarding its own security and pursuing international relationships based on equality and mutual respect, Ghana is sending a powerful message to the world. It is a sovereign nation that is ready to shape its own future, free from foreign control and influence. Ghana's decision to close US military bases on its soil has sparked a wider conversation across Africa, serving as a potential model for other nations on the continent that are seeking to reclaim their sovereignty and reduce the influence of foreign powers. This bold move reflects a growing sentiment within many African countries that they should not be subjected to the military presence of foreign nations, especially those that have historically used Africa as a strategic chessboard for their own geopolitical and security interests. Ghana's decision is not only a signal of the country's commitment to self-determination, but also a challenge to the status quo of foreign military involvement in Africa, opening the door for other nations to reevaluate their own relationships with global powers and assert greater control over their future. For many African countries, the legacy of colonialism has left a deep imprint on their political and military landscapes. The presence of foreign military forces on African soil, whether through formal military bases or various forms of intervention, has often been associated with the continuation of that colonial legacy. Many see these foreign military bases as remnants of past imperial powers, attempting to maintain influence and control over African nations. For these countries, Ghana's move to close foreign military bases is a courageous stand, representing a departure from the old ways of interacting with former colonial powers and an embrace of greater autonomy in all aspects of governance, including security. Ghana's decision, therefore, is not just about one country's relationship with the United States, but is part of a larger trend in which African nations are increasingly seeking to determine their own security policies and move away from the reliance on foreign military forces to address internal or regional conflicts. The decision also represents an opportunity for African nations to rethink their security strategies, promoting a model of self-sufficiency and regional cooperation rather than dependence on foreign military powers. In many parts of the continent, the presence of foreign military forces has been justified by the need to combat terrorism, insurgency, and instability. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Somalia have hosted foreign military forces as part of international efforts to combat extremist groups. While these foreign interventions have often been framed as necessary for regional security, they have also been criticized for fostering a dependence on external powers, which in turn undermines the ability of African governments to develop their own indigenous security solutions. Ghana's bold move could inspire other nations to explore alternative approaches, emphasizing the strengthening of regional security frameworks and the building of local defense capabilities. Through organizations like the African Union (AU) and ECOWAS, African nations can collaborate to address shared security challenges without relying on foreign military presence. Moreover, Ghana's decision could have a ripple effect across the continent, encouraging other African nations to take a firmer stance on issues of sovereignty and security. If Ghana can close foreign military bases and assert its right to control its own security, why couldn't other African countries do the same? While the political and security dynamics of each country are unique, the growing sentiment across the continent is one of rejecting foreign intervention and seeking alternative ways to address internal and regional security challenges. Ghana's leadership in this regard may serve as an example for other nations grappling with the question of foreign military presence and the implications it has for their autonomy. If other nations, particularly in West and Central Africa, follow Ghana's example, this could lead to a broader movement towards the assertion of African sovereignty and independence in foreign relations. This shift toward reclaiming sovereignty also aligns with a broader vision for a united and self-reliant Africa. Ghana has long been a champion of Pan-Africanism, and its decision to close foreign military bases resonates with the ideals of self-determination that were championed by early African leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah. These leaders envisioned a united Africa free from foreign control and interference, where nations could cooperate and pursue collective prosperity without the shadow of colonialism hanging over them. Ghana's action, in this sense, can be seen as a symbolic return to these Pan-African ideals, reasserting the continent's right to define its own destiny and security policies. The growing desire for autonomy is not only about resisting external military presence, but also about rejecting the broader structures of dependency that have historically shaped Africa's relationship with the rest of the world. In the current global order, the increasing influence of China, Russia, and other non-Western powers in Africa has added new dimensions to this conversation. These countries are seeking to expand their economic, political, and military influence on the continent, offering an alternative to the traditional Western dominance. Ghana's decision to close U.S. military bases could therefore signal a shift toward a more diversified approach to international relations in Africa. By asserting its independence from Western powers, Ghana is positioning itself to explore new opportunities for cooperation with rising global powers. This could spark a wider re-evaluation of Africa's foreign partnerships, as countries look to strike a balance between Western, Chinese, Russian, and other international influences, ultimately putting African nations in a stronger position to negotiate on their own terms. However, this move also poses risks. Some argue that the closure of foreign military bases could leave Ghana vulnerable to regional instability or conflict, particularly if other powers seek to exert their influence through other means, such as economic leverage or military support for local armed groups. In the absence of foreign military presence, the ability of Ghana to effectively manage security threats could come under pressure. Nonetheless, supporters of the decision argue that by taking control of its own security, Ghana will be better positioned to respond to these challenges through its own means, including strengthening its own military capabilities, collaborating with neighboring countries, and fostering regional cooperation. This approach, while perhaps more difficult in the short term, could lead to a more sustainable model of peace and stability in the long term, one that is driven by African solutions to African problems. Ghana's bold decision sets a powerful precedent for other African nations, offering a clear example of how countries can reclaim their sovereignty, assert control over their own future, and develop independent security frameworks. The message is clear: Africa's time to define its own future has come, and Ghana's courageous move may inspire others to follow suit. Whether this leads to a broader trend of African nations seeking to remove foreign military forces, or simply sparks a deeper conversation about Africa's role in shaping its own security landscape, Ghana's decision will undoubtedly be remembered as a pivotal moment in the continent's ongoing quest for self-determination and independence.